Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is once again a reading of Player vs. Player by Reyna on AO3. This is a violent work of fan fiction, so if you don't like that or if it's triggering for you, I would please go do something else. And without further ado, please enjoy my reading. Thank you. Sasha visits her. She thought it was a dream at first, and maybe it was. Maybe it still is. A comforting lie that her brain has conjured up in order to try and process some of the pain, some of the trauma that has befallen her. Maybe when she closes her eyes at night, Sasha's is the name she calls for her in her sleep because she knows that she'll probably never get to say it again to her face in anything less than damnation. Or maybe, just maybe, it isn't. Her first memory of it is hazy, to be fair, and she thinks it was still before she managed to penetrate that strange place she was in for those first 2 weeks of recovery. Not quite conscious, but definitely no longer asleep. She remembers a face, steely green eyes, and the pressure of a hand on her cheek. A dream? Almost certainly. Except for one little detail. It happened again. She remembers the pressure at her cheek and how her eyes had fluttered open. She remembers the frightened face she had found once they had. Her head hurt. Her thoughts were fuzzy at best, and she felt it if she somehow managed to swallow an entire bag of sand. Sash. She had barely gotten the first syllable out before the girl fled. Not left. Fled. She spun so quickly on her heel that Anne feared she'd give herself whiplash, and tore, not out the door, but off the balcony before she could even process what to do about that. Anne waited with bated breath for the next half hour, fruitlessly scanning the horizon for any sign, even a glimpse that would prove that what she had seen was real, that Sasha had actually been there. Nothing. And again, she would have written it off as her tired, traumatized brain playing tricks on her if it weren't for that one crucial detail. It happened again. And again, and again. Sasha kept coming back. The next few visits were just like the first two, short and quiet, punctuated by her fleeing at the slightest sign that she might have been caught. She never spoke, never stayed longer than a few minutes at a time, and she always looked like hell. Honestly, she was giving Marcy a run for her money at this point. The visits were inconsistent at first. They didn't seem to follow any pattern other than always occurring at night, and always when Anne was alone. Marcy made a point to visit Anne at least once every 2 days, but as time went by and the city night guard grew more and more busy, her visits became shorter and earlier in the day. Eventually, she'd taken to just visiting Anne on her lunch and dinner breaks, as that was the only time she wasn't up to her neck in paperwork. The planters came by every day, but again, those visits were kept to the light hours of the day, and were always interspersed between the excessive doctors and physical therapist appointments that Anne was being forced to undergo. The night was the only time she was alone, and so the only times when Sasha visited. Always random, never consistent. Sometimes she'd even visit multiple times in one night. Anne never told anyone about it. Oh, she probably should have, but she wasn't doing any harm, and on the off chance that she was hallucinating, the visits, it wouldn't have helped anyone to worry them with the details. They had enough going on at the moment. From what she'd heard and the few things Marcy let slip during her visits, it looked like the Newts and the Toads were gearing up for an all-out war. Yeah, they had enough to worry about without a potential enemy-behind-lines situation. So Anne kept her mouth shut, her head bowed, and a painted smile on her face. She was getting better. She would get better if it killed her. It was all she could do. It was what everyone wanted, and so she would do it. So what if Sasha was haunting her like a particularly flighty ghost? She'd already done her worst. What else could she possibly want? Her dead? She really hopes that wasn't the case. But sometimes, when Sasha visits, Anne pretends to be asleep. Sometimes she keeps her eyes closed and doesn't move, even as she can hear Sasha's rhythmic tapping of her boot against the linoleum floor. And sometimes, when the silence has pervaded her every thought, when the moon has almost reached its full state, when the tapping has become nothing more than another part of the utopian nightlife, she can hear something wet running down Sasha's face. Sometimes she thinks she can hear her sniffling, and keeps her eyes closed. Well, Miss Boonchoy, I believe I can safely say that your recovery is progressing nicely. The newt that acts as her doctor is a small fellow. He can't be much taller than a hot pop. His skin is a cool blue, and perched upon his nose is the single thickest pair of glasses that she has ever seen. He smiles at her from the other side of his clipboard. We should be able to move forward with the prosthetic by the end of the week. Anne offers her best smile and ignores the strange, twisting feeling rising in her gut. That's great. The doctor beams at her. It's always confused her as to how and why amphibians in this world have teeth. I'll have a talk with Lady Marcy next time she comes in about blueprints for one. I'm certain the metalsmiths will be thrilled at the challenge. The twisting feeling in Anne's gut gets worse. Oh, don't bother her with that. She's already busy enough. A nonchalant wave is made using her hand, though she doesn't remember thinking to do that. Her smile remains in place, and she forces a laugh. I can just practice with an amphibian one until she gets some more free time. The doctor frowns, and the twisting feeling contorts sharply. I don't know. I don't believe our anatomy is similar enough for that, but you do make a point on Lady Marcy's availability. He hums with a thought. I should really have a talk with King Andreas about that. It can't be good for her. Anne shrugs, but internally, she wants to scream her agreement. Last time she saw her, Marcy's skin was a pale color she'd only seen in paint sets before. The appointment wraps up with a few more exercises, mostly just stretching her arms in new and interesting ways, and some instructions to alert anyone should she start to feel lightheaded or whatever. Honestly, Anne's heard the spiel so many times at this point she could probably recite it in her sleep. She wonders if she does. She's escorted back to her room and then left to her own devices. The energy drains out of her the moment the door closes. They took off her bandages 3 days ago. She still can't bring herself to look at it. Marcy had spent all of her last visit holding it, as if she was trying to remind herself it was real. The sensation of fingers running against the places where they grafted skin over itself wasn't something that she thinks she'll ever get used to. It wasn't unpleasant, not necessarily, just strange. Does it still hurt? Sprigg had asked her that morning. Not really, she'd answered. It doesn't really feel like anything. It throbs, aches, prickles, but there's nothing there. No hand to throb, to ache. She reaches down with her remaining hand and closes it around the stump. She'd gotten lucky, the doctor said. The cut was low enough that they could save the majority of her wrist muscles. Once she got a prosthetic, they predicted she'd be able to use it for most things. Writing, not included. Learning to write with her right hand was going to be a pain. Everything was going to be a pain. Gosh, life was a pain. A sharp jolt ran down her spine, and she sunk her teeth into her bottom lip to try and quell the sudden urge to cry. She couldn't cry. She refused. There was too much at stake, too much happening. She had to recover, had to get better, had to show Marcy and the planters that she was the same old Anne they'd always known, the same Anne who smiled in the face of adversity, the same Anne who would always be there for them with a cheerful smile and a supportive attitude. They were staring down the barrel of a gun right now. They couldn't afford to deal with her grievances. She would get better. She had to. Time healed all wounds, and so she would just wait it out. She'd be okay. The taste of salt is a familiar one. A huff of air escapes her as she releases her stump in order to clasp her hand against her eyes, wiping desperately at the moisture. It doesn't stop the sobs from escaping. She can't. It's a horrible sound, she'd decided weeks ago, how it rattled in her chest and escaped her in a wet cough. She hates the sound, hates it with a passion, but try as she might, she can't make it stop. All she can do is wait it out. That's all she can do. Wait. Wait for Marcy's schedule to lighten so she can actually talk to her. Wait for the phantom pains to stop coming. Wait for the newts and toads to decide when they're going to attack each other. Wait for the nightmares to stop happening. Wait for Metal to stop giving her heart attacks. Wait for her body to recover enough blood that her legs stop shaking every time she walks more than 100 steps. Wait, wait, wait. All she can do is wait. She's so tired of waiting. Finally, the sobs stop. The ache in her chest falls back into a dull throbbing rather than a sharp pain. The tears on her face and hand dry. The tingling in her lost limb stops. The wait is over, for now. Anne lets out a sigh and slowly makes her way over to the balcony. The sun is setting. She must have been in that appointment longer than she thought. She missed Marcy's dinner break. If she even had a dinner break today. Another sigh builds up in her chest, and she forces herself to swallow it. Marcy's a big girl. She can make her own decisions. Her worrying after her will only result in more grief for the both of them. She already knows that Marcy is going to lose her crap on her the moment she figures out just how much she's been hiding from her. Faintly, her lips twitch. All things considered, it's good to know that at least one of her friendships is still stable. It's good to know that after everything, Marcy still has her back, even if she's killing herself to do it. The corners of her mouth fall once again. Her fist clenches. The muscles in her left arm try to mimic the motion, and all she gets for her trouble is another dull ache. God, Marcy. Something about the way that Marcy looked in that ranger getup, something about the excitement that she got when she was explaining all the things she'd accomplished in her time in Utopia. Something about the way her eyes sparkled when she got a new idea. Something about Marcy had changed. And Anne's feelings toward her had changed as well. As strange as it was to admit, and even stranger to think about, all things considered, this most recent development had only succeeded in furthering her understanding in her relationship with Marcy. All horrible, scarring, stressful, traumatic experiences aside, Marcy was still there for her. Marcy was breaking her back, sacrificing her time, her sleep, her everything to make sure that Anne had the best possible chance of recovering, the best possible chance of getting to go home. Marcy very obviously cared for her in a not just friendly capacity, and Anne was starting to think that maybe she did too. She just wasn't sure she was capable of dealing with it at the moment. There was so much that she had to try and process. She didn't really have the mental capacity to deal with growing feelings for the one person she knows still has her back. Well, not the only person. She has the planters, but the planters can't come back to the human world with her. If she gets back. Anne's arms come to cross over her chest, and her remaining hand loosens from its fist only to clench around her upper arm. That's a thought she'd had to entertain a lot recently, even before this whole incident. Yes, theoretically, they have an idea of what they have to do to get home, but there are still so many complications in the way that even if they do somehow manage to do it, she's not the same person who left. And she knows that Marcy isn't either, and Sasha, they're not going to be able to act the same way when they get back. They're going to spend the rest of their lives carrying with them the scars they faced in Amphibia. Sure, some of the things she's experienced she wouldn't trade for the world, but others, she's lost a hand. If they never leave, Anne almost suspects she could carve out a life here. There are plenty of frogs or newts, or frog forbid, toads that carry similar injuries. This world will only look at remains of Anne and not bat an eye. Plenty of others wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Here, the only odd thing about Anne is that she's human, and even then, these past few months have shown her that even that can be overlooked. Back home, though, if it wasn't the missing limb, it'd be the nightmares. If it wasn't that, it'd be the newfound taste for bugs. If it wasn't that, it'd be her newly acquired abilities in sword fighting, and if it wasn't that, the list went on. Another sigh finally claws its way out of her throat, and she sighs against the balcony's doorframe. The sun has all but disappeared over the horizon, leaving stars and the glowing moon in its wake. it started to wane again. She's been in recovery for a month now. A month. 2 weeks unconscious, 2 weeks awake, and what does she have to show for it? The ability to stand, she supposes. Consciousness for another. Suddenly, Anne freezes. There's something moving against the wall below. No, not just moving, but moving upwards. Something is climbing the wall. Someone. All of the blood in Anne's body goes rushing down, away from her face. She feels dizzy from the force of it. She's coming. She's climbing towards her. And Anne's awake for once. Slowly, carefully, Anne backs away from the doorframe, not into the room, no. Instead, she presses herself against the opposite wall, even as the rustling of vines on the outside of the building gets louder and louder. She's not going to let her get away this time. Boots meet tile, a long, drawn-out sigh, following soon after. Anne can feel the breath stealing inside of her throat. The city lights create a pool upon the linoleum floor, and in its multicolored light, she can just make out the silhouette of a human girl, even from the exertion of the climb. It grows as she watches, boots clicking as their wearer approaches, steps soft and unsure. A head emerges. Soft blonde hair has gone stringy from lack of bathing, dirt-stained cheeks and piercing gray eyes that glint in the shadows like the blade strapped to her waist. A warrior, a fighter, a champion. Standing like her whole body is carved from steel, like the earth itself could crack open beneath her feet and she'd remain standing, strong and untouched. Her gaze narrows upon Anne's bed, the bunched-up covers making for a convincing double. She's never been an elegant sleeper, before she finally lets her guard down. The tension seeps out of her shoulders. The shine of her metal-like eyes dims, and she can see the girl hidden beneath her paper-thin armor. She crosses the space between the door and the bed in 5 strides, and though her steps are sure, Anne can see how they slow. Her hands come up to tremble, hovering over the covers like she isn't quite sure if she's allowed to touch them. They're pale in the light, practically glowing, like a ghost, or a memory, or a dream. Anne can feel something dropping in her gut. What if... No, this isn't a dream, and she isn't going to let it be. This has to be real, has to be. Sasha has to be here, because if she isn't, if this is a dream, if there's nothing there, then there's no hope left. Not for Sasha, not for her, and not for Marcy. Because if Sasha isn't here, then she's never going to be. And if she isn't, then Anne will never be able to forgive herself for not being able to pull her back from the dark. And if Anne doesn't forgive herself, she won't get better, and Marcy will drive herself into an early grave from the stress of trying to pick up the pieces. This has to be real. She has to believe that. She has to. Sasha drops her hands, not touching the covers, and a breath escapes her. I'm a coward.